Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and honestly kind of absurd journeys in history. We're going to explore exactly how a sprawling, profit-driven megacorporation accidentally laid the entire legal framework for a modern nation. Think about that for a second. We're talking about the East India Company, basically a massive group of private traders, and we're going to trace how their actions directly triggered the Regulating Act of 1773. This was a piece of legislation that absolutely shifted the course of global history. So get comfortable because this is a truly incredible story.
So how exactly does a rogue trading company end up shaping a modern constitution? It sounds almost impossible, right? But the decisions made to rein in the East India Company centuries ago actually planted the foundational roots for the 1950 Constitution of India. Today, we're unpacking the historical background of British rule in India, and we're going to look really closely at the key features of that 1773 Regulating Act. As you'll see, rules meant to control an 18th century business still echo loudly today.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Roots of Modern India, from Corporation to Constitution. It's a pretty striking historical paradox, but various features of the modern independent Indian constitution and polity have their very roots deep in British rule. The essential legal framework for how the government and administration are organized didn't just appear out of thin air in 1950. No way. There were very specific, concrete events during the era of British India that built this legal architecture. These events heavily influenced the modern setup. So to really understand the Constitution of today, we have to look back at the rulebook of the past. Moving on to Section 2, Traders to Territorial Power, 1600 to 1950. Let's map out this sweeping historical arc, because the timeline is wild. We start all the way back in 1600. The British first show up in India purely as traders, organized under the East India Company. They actually had an exclusive right to trade in India thanks to a charter from Queen Elizabeth I. Fast forward to 1765, and they get their hands on something called Diwani. Then, by 1858, following the Sepoy Mutiny, the British Crown basically says enough is enough and steps in to assume direct responsibility for governing India, completely ending the company's rule. This direct British rule sticks around all the way until independence is finally granted on August 15, 1947. Now, with independence came the massive task of creating a constitution. M.N. Roy, a pioneer of the communist movement in India, had actually pitched the idea of a constituent assembly way back in 1934. That assembly finally formed in 1946, and on January 26, 1950, the modern constitution officially came into being. I mean, that is a massive evolution from a 1600 royal trading charter to a sovereign democratic republic. Now, the real pivot point in this whole timeline, it's 1765. Up until that year, the East India Company was just a business, purely trading functions. They were there to buy and sell, plain and simple. But then they obtained the Diwani. And Diwani was a game changer. It meant they now had the rights over revenue and civil justice, specifically in the incredibly wealthy regions of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was the exact moment the company morphed from pure traders into a formidable territorial power. They weren't just merchants anymore. They were essentially acting like a full-blown government, collecting taxes and dispensing justice.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 1773 Regulating Act. The British government steps in. So before 1773, the company was essentially running its own independent, somewhat rogue operations out there. But the Regulating Act of 1773 changed absolutely everything. This act is of immense constitutional importance because it was the very first step the British government took to officially control and regulate what the East India Company was doing in India. For the first time ever, the British government legally recognized the political and administrative functions of the company. It was the moment London looked over and said, okay, you're no longer just a business. You are governing, and we are watching. It laid down the very bedrock of central administration in India.
Let's dig into Section 4, Centralizing an Empire, Key Features of the Act. Okay, let's break down the specific rules they used to tighten the leash. The first major feature centers around the number 4. The act took the governor of Bengal and gave him a massive promotion, making him the Governor General of Bengal. Lord Warren Hastings was the first to hold the title. But to make sure he didn't start ruling like an absolute monarch, they created an executive council of exactly 4 members to assist him. This was literally the birth of an executive cabinet-style system in Indian administration. The second feature was a massive move for centralization. Earlier on, the three British presidencies, Bengal, Bombay, and Madras, were entirely independent of one another. They operated as their own separate fiefdoms. So the crucial takeaway here is that this act made the governors of Bombay and Madras completely subordinate to the newly minted Governor General of Bengal. Those previously independent regional governors were now forced under one powerful, centralized authority. The era of fragmentation was officially ending. Third up, they brought in the law. The act provided for the establishment of a formal judiciary, specifically a Supreme Court at Calcutta, which was set up in 1774. We're talking one Chief Justice and 3 other judges. Setting up this Supreme Court was a direct, calculated attempt to enforce legal order, justice, and British law over the company's vast and, let's be honest, often highly chaotic territories. Fourth, we absolutely have to talk about the corruption, because it was rampant. Company employees were getting incredibly wealthy on the side, and it was happening at the expense of both the local population and the company's own bottom line. So the 1773 Act cracked down hard. It essentially banned these highly lucrative side hustles. It strictly prohibited the servants of the company from engaging in any private trade whatsoever. On top of that, it explicitly banned them from accepting presents or bribes. This was a sweeping anti-corruption measure designed to force these employees to actually serve the organization, rather than just lining their own pockets. And finally, the 5th key feature. This one is perhaps the most important for long-term accountability. The act significantly strengthened the British government's control over the company by demanding a strict reporting mechanism. The Court of Directors, the actual governing body of the company, was now legally required to report directly to the British government on all its revenues, civil and military affairs in India. They could no longer operate in the shadows. London demanded to see the books, the plans, the whole shebang. Which brings us to a final thought for you to chew on. How do rules designed to control an 18th century megacorporation still echo in modern administrative governance today? Think about it. The centralization of power, the creation of an executive council, establishing a Supreme Court, enforcing strict anti-corruption laws for officials, and mandating transparent reporting to a higher authority. These initial attempts by the British government to rein in corporate power fundamentally forged the administrative DNA of the region. As you reflect on everything we've covered today, consider how the legal framework of modern nations so often rests on historical trimming points, exactly like the Regulating Act of 1773. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helped you really visualize that fascinating transition from a rogue trading company to the roots of a modern constitution.